having me speak to you tonight. As Ashley so clearly said, I will be talking to you guys about the management decisions through drought, and then any of those long-term effects of, the decisions we make today. How is that going to impact us, 20 years down the line? And so first things first is, planning for that drought. And so, a good basis is, where to even begin. And so a lot of that is just understanding, what's going to work for you, what you have to work with, different opportunities that might come by. And then from there, you can kind of start to develop, maybe what your trigger point's going to be. So, when you're actually going to put this plan into action, whether it's, trying to look at what precipitation is going to do, or if you haven't received as much by a certain date. It could be maybe some, what's available in your forage at that time. Maybe some lease agreements are up. It makes it a little easier for you, whatever that might be. And then, a question that might come through is, can I change my plan as I go? And the answer is, well, yes and no. So you can for sure have these plan in place and then have other opportunities that might arise, such as if you choose to supplement and have different supplementation strategies in your pocket, then sure. You can kind of choose based off of, what your forage is doing and also price of commodities at the time. And then, of course, again, as I said, what are those long-term impacts? And so I'll discuss a little bit about some of those management decisions and then kind of that long-term impact. But kind of thinking about that, that's where you can really start reviewing the decisions that you made, measures that were taken in terms of, what worked for me, what didn't work for me. And then, again, just revise that plan. And so, what you use one time might not be great for the next time, or, however. So there is some fluidity with this. But again, it's knowing what works best for you, right? And so kind of the big portion of this is, knowing what you have to work with. And so what is your forage doing is going to drive a lot of this, right? And so what is happening at the time, where is the state of that forage right now? And so I'm, big supporter of doing those grass clippings, because, if we think, traditionally my forage might be 10% crude protein, but, we've gone through the drought, or maybe you're going through a cold, but whatever it might be, now you might be sitting at 4% crude protein, and now we run into an issue, right? So just kind of understanding that foundational basis, and then also understanding your herd, right? So you understand, your production goals, the genetics that are going into it. And then also understanding some of those drivers of what those cows are going to need. So, if you are increasing, growth or milk yield in your herd, that's going to really increase what those cows are going to want and need for those resources, along with, the age and size of that animal as well. So from first having that basis, and then now we can kind of decide, okay, so what is that trigger point? And this might look different for everybody, right? So again, it's whatever works best for you. Due to the fact that, being in the Southwest, the monsoon season is pretty critical to some of that forage production. So, you might just decide, if I don't have adequate precipitation by a certain month, then this is when we start and engage this plan. And then, commit to that plan. Here we are, we created it, let's see how it goes. And then start with some of those quick decisions. And I don't mean that those decisions that were easy to make, or, that are fast. It's because with the drought, none of that is easy, right? It's dealing with a lot of uncertainty and, things that are completely out of your control, but the quick decisions that, you can cause some big changes really quickly. So for instance, supplements being a big one of those. I'm actually not going to talk too much about this, because Ashley's going to talk more in depth about it later, but just, kind of keeping to that strategy of, this is one of those quick decisions that you can see a quick turnaround on. Another one being, changing some important dates. So weaning early is pretty popular, especially when you think so during a cow's production lifetime in that year, her highest energy requirement or just resource requirement is going to be during lactation. And so with weaning early, you actually are able to save about 10 pounds of forage per day each day that calf is weaned, okay? Which can also give you about 0.4 days worth of grazing for that dry cow. So again, it's kind of helping, again, try to figure out, this is the resources we're allotted basically, and how might we stretch that without causing too much damage. Kind of in line with that and looking at, okay, the long-term sort of perspective of this, there's been some work that looked at, early weaning with some young and thin cows, and they saw it to be pretty advantageous for that herd. Okay, so these young cows are, kind of already a little bit of a risk in terms of, they're still trying to grow into their mature mama cow size. Now they're going through their first lactation. And if the range isn't adequate for them, then they start to enter into this kind of survival mode, which we refer to as a negative energy balance. And so basically her whole entire system goes into, okay, keep that calf alive, so produce milk, and then keep me alive. So they're not going to be too worried about conception. So if we wean them early in times of, having kind of that inadequate forage, we actually see that we might be able to salvage some of that fertility. Now, when we look at the calf rate, so we actually didn't see any differences between at least calf weight performance within the study. So again, maybe suggesting that this could be, a kind of rescue philosophy with that. Now, the calves' performance at this time, even though they are early weaned, about 8 weeks old, is when a calf kind of has a fully functioning rumen, or suggested to have a fully functional rumen. And so that calf can, graze on the forage just fine. So, kind of, again, letting that calf into its own devices while taking some of the stress off that cow. Now, by decreasing that nutrient stress on that cow from that lactation, we're doing two things. One, we're, preserving some of that forage availability, but two is really setting up that female for success. So we're not really sacrificing that cow productivity and potentially helping, keep her in the herd maybe a little longer, being able to conceive a calf for that next year so she's able to still be productive for you. And so just kind of keeping that on the back of your mind. Another popular method is going through that culling process, right? So understanding what your, production benchmark is or production goal is, and basically just identifying which cows are not meeting that. During a drought time, we might be a little bit stricter on these culling strategies in terms of, if they're just missing the mark, well, they're at risk, so they got to go. A big kind of helper tool that we can use for this as well is looking at body condition of the herd. So if you have some thin cows at the beginning of the drought, as the drought gets worse, there's not going to be a whole lot of nutrient for her to utilize. And so she's just going to continue to kind of go downhill and crash. So, kind of culling those thinner cows out would potentially be a good idea. As well as, thinning out some of the older cows. They've already kind of reached that reproductive prime. Some people believe that middle age of, from a 4, 5, 6-year-old is kind of your most efficient, kind of resilient age in terms of, they're still pretty reproductively prime. They might be able to bounce back a little bit during some stressful periods. And so kind of culling on either ends of that. Now, when we think about this, though, a big proponent of this is, the genetics that stay in the herd, right? And so this is where this kind of longevity aspect comes into play. And so looking at how the future of, whatever that cow herd is and how the genetics are going to interact with that is going to be a big portion of this. And so that selection pressure that we just put on them, right? So if you do a big cull or, as I said, kind of helping some of those cows, either gain weight or breed for the next year, that's another kind of genetic pressure that you're putting into that animal. And so you're potentially creating, almost this resiliency model for them. And so you're kind of moving that benchmark. And so it's about, almost think of it kind of like this ebb and flow of, you start moving thresholds by doing this. And so, kind of, again, thinking of that genetic component, all we're doing is just moving that threshold. And so we're either going to, those cows that survived the drought and were productive, now they're going to pass those genetics on to their offspring and then maybe inject some resiliency within them and so on and so forth. And that's kind of how we're moving that threshold. Another popular question that comes to play is the, heifers born in drought. Are they, basically bomb proof? Can they handle, anything? And so this is a question I'll answer towards the end of it, but just kind of keeping in mind too of that genetic component. And so when we look at, how genetics and environment interact, there's a saying that, basically the genetics kind of set you up, but the environment's going to really kind of push out what you're going to see, right? And so if you're going to start selecting for increased growth, say for weaning weight, sometimes we inadvertently also select for increased milk yield, which is going to increase those cow nutrient requirements, right? And so it's kind of this delicate balance of, trying to make sure that we're selecting animals and selecting those traits that are fit for the environment. Now, I'm not saying selecting for weaning weight is terrible. I'm not saying that at all. All I'm saying is just be cautious that we're not also inadvertently increasing that cow's requirements, because that might create a wreck for us later on down the road. Now, this kind of brings into that idea of, again, matching cow to environment. And we also know, frame size is going to play a big role in this as well, because, well, these animals, the bigger they are, the more they're going to need. And so as we increase that cow size, we are going to increase, that forage that they're going to need, some of the costs associated with that as well. But also, again, it's about matching the environment. So, if you don't have a lot of forage or resources at the time, it might not be a great idea to put a 1,600-pound animal out there who's going to require a lot, right? She might break down a little bit more. Not to say that it doesn't happen or it can't happen, but this is just kind of some of the guidelines we follow with that. Now, when we think about the future now, so this is, we're thinking about these cows and how we're selecting for them. And we start thinking about the future of, okay, what's going to happen with those offspring? This idea of fetal programming comes to play, right? And so this is that whole, this maternal stress of whatever these cows are going to encounter while they're pregnant. That animal that's inside the womb is also going to experience the same stress. So there's been a ton of research that's looked at all these different maternal stresses during different parts of gestation and what happens to those animals. And we know that it does, in fact, impact, that progeny on a long-term basis, impacting different health issues, whether it's them at weaning or entering in a feedlot, some issues with growth, as well as some fertility, both good and bad, I should say. But we do know that this is a very real thing. So how does that actually apply to the drought? Well, you have that decreased precipitation, you have this drought. Now we've created this, decreased forage availability and quality, right? Now, from a management perspective, yes, you're going to have an increase in cost of production, because now you're going to have to worry about, supplementation costs, maybe some labor costs, maybe you're going to have to rotate pastures more, whatever that might look like. But when we just keep to the idea of, that environment, what's happening there, and just looking at for it is what it is at that time, that decrease in available resources is going to create this nutrient restricted state, which can reduce animal performance. Now, where does this come into with the precipitation? So we did a study at New Mexico State where we looked at just that, does precipitation level during gestation impact calf success? Now, this was a 46-year data set that we took from our college ranch that was just outside of Las Cruces city limits. So it's right in the Chihuahuan Desert. And basically we took like 2,000 cow records, and they looked, or that had, all of the cow metrics on there, but also their calf. So we looked at calf growth. We also tracked those heifer calves that might have stayed in the herd, and just tried to look at, okay, so what's happening? The kind of key aspects of this was, trying to figure out, okay, so if we look at that calf's life while it's in the womb, from breeding to calving, what does that level of precipitation do? And then, of course, being in the Southwest, that monsoon period being pretty essential, we also wanted to look at that time period as well, not only for just because of the importance of forage production, but also during that first trimester, there's some really key development things that are happening to that calf that might really kind of set off just how successful or how much of an epic fail it might be later on. So based off of all of those years, we had 15% of them as low, which was below our average, and then high. And our average around that area is about 9 inches of precip. And so it's nothing too crazy. But what we were able to find from all of this is that, increased precipitation, and so kind of that high or wet sort of time while in the womb, during that entire time that calf was in the womb, and looking at that first trimester, we saw an increase in calf body weight at birth. And then we also saw an increase at weaning weight. And so this could potentially be a marker of, you have this increased precipitation. So you're having this increase in forage quality and quantity. Therefore, that cow is able to intake more and send more nutrients to that calf, thus creating this effect. What's interesting, though, is that when you look at the heifer side and look at heifer productivity, we actually see an opposite. So heifers who experienced a low precipitation, again, while they were in the womb and during that monsoon period, actually had a greater number of calves in their lifetime, as well as having a larger percentage stay in the herd after that 8-year mark. And so it's just something that's really interesting, because you would think it would be the opposite, because as we know from fetal programming, with the nutrient restriction, we see that reduced animal performance. However, what we think is happening is that these animals that are experiencing this stress might be programmed in a way where they're actually more adapted to their intended environment. So with them, experiencing that drought while not even on the ground yet, when they actually are trying to be, productive and in the herd, when they experience another situation similarly, they actually are able to respond to it better. And this is kind of similar to some data out of Wyoming, where they looked at bags ewes and a really extensive rangeland, and kind of did something similar, but with nutrient restriction instead of precipitation, comparing a basically open range versus a confined flock, and found that, again, those animals that came from that open range flock had no difference when they were nutrient restricted. And so they performed very similarly. So again, kind of thinking of this idea that this programming might actually be creating these kind of resilient females. Now, I'm not saying this is a silver bullet. I'm not saying, yes, we need to select all the animals like this, because this is just what kind of worked within this study. There are some things to keep in mind as well. So again, as we go through drought situations, we do have those management decisions that could potentially be altering some of this or influencing it. So what do I mean by that? Well, during drought time, you might supplement more, and so increase that intake. So that might be influencing this. You also might, again, with those culling strategies, the genetics might be playing a role in this as well. I mean, there's certainly some other areas that could be impacting this, but it is something to keep in mind moving forward in terms of maybe seeing some trends within, future herds. But kind of the big takeaways out of all of this is, create that drought plan. You might already have one, you might not have one yet, you might already be in the middle of one, but just make sure you have a plan kind of set. And again, make sure you're using those drought management decisions that are going to be best for you, right? So whatever works for you might not necessarily work for your neighbor or their neighbor, but whatever works best for you and your operation, as well as meeting, again, your production benchmarks and goals. And then, of course, keeping those genetics in mind, not only of what you're keeping within your herd, but what you might be introducing, and then what you also might be helping kind of create later on, which could be feeding into these, different opportunities to create that resiliency and some of that longevity within the herd. But overall, thank you so much for listening to my little spiel. And with that, I will take any questions that you might have at this time.
Okay, well, thank you so much. So I know that we've got some questions out there. There was one that I saw. Have any studies looked at this interaction between heifer longevity and how their steers do in the feedlot?
So I do know that there is some studies that have looked at them separately. Sorry, just for clarification, are you talking about like heifer longevity? So like looking at those heifers that are resilient and like their steer progeny, or just like steers and heifers? Sorry.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
No, I was reading it, so I don't. The progeny of drought heifers.
Oh, okay. So we actually haven't, at least I haven't come across anything that has looked at drought heifers and steer feedlot performance, but I do know, with the fetal programming stuff, that there is a lot of studies that have looked at like different supplementation during gestation, and that does have an impact on the feedlot performance in some of those calves. So I would say that there might be something there.
Okay, super. So I have another one, and please, people, feel free to put some questions in the question and answer box. So we have one that says, what type of cows seem to do better in drought conditions?
It's a great question. So every time we think about drought, we also understand, we're not just talking about this lack of precipitation. We're also dealing with a lot of heat stress environment, like moments. I wouldn't say that there's like one golden breed. Having some of those breeds that are a little heat tolerant might do a little bit better during a drought. But I mean, some cattle, just because they've been in their environment for so long and they're so well adapted, could be just fine. So I think it just kind of depends on a little bit of the cow history, but yeah, sorry, I don't have a great answer for that one.
Okay. Who else has some questions? I know there's somebody that had a question out there. Ashley, did you, or Nate, I was thinking, what kind of thing? So might you ask if you were, since you guys are here in Arizona, what kind of things come to mind that some of your people might be interested in knowing? Nate? Maybe Nate's disappeared. There he is.
Can't think of any questions off the top of my head. As far as the breed question, I think that goes back to Joslyn. I guess could you comment on how heterosis plays a part in drought resistance, and what, because again, like you say, it's kind of hard to pick one breed over the others, but does heterosis have anything to do with it?
Okay, so I think, yes, I think there, to a certain degree, heterosis does play a role in it. Especially if you start thinking, and I keep kind of going back to those heat tolerant breeds, just because of that heat stress component that was so often joined with the drought stress. But yes, I think that there can be some advantage with it. Again, just err on caution in terms of trying not to create too big of an animal. That's the only thing.
Okay, we have another. The 110 pounds of animal equals 600 pounds of forage numbers are over what time period?
So that was done with dry cows, and that was done actually out of Oklahoma State. I can share that link if you want to look at it. And so it just looked at basically their overall needs as a dry animal, and so that was, yeah. I'm trying to think what the forage was. I think being that it was in Oklahoma, it was probably a little bit wetter, but that's kind of what they came to be.
Okay, and so in between, you can dig up that link and you'll put that in chat?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. So we have another question. In drought conditions, what is the earliest age to wean?
That's a good one. So based off of the studies that I've seen and some things that people do, I think 6 weeks is kind of a safe mark. Just because, again, when we think about rumen development, we don't want to stress that calf too much in terms of trying to consume something that it's not completely ready for. So I would say you'd be pretty okay with 6 weeks.
Okay, and we have so put your questions in the Q&A, but we have one here that says, are there any studies on calving season during a drought, such as fall versus spring?
So there's not one specific for drought, but there have been some studies that looked at calving season, specifically just basically chasing forage production and the growing season. There has been some discussion as to should you shift your breeding season in order to combat the drought. I think that would be on a short-term basis sounds great, but I don't know about a long-term basis, just because again, following that forage growth and season and kind of thinking about that, it changes year by year. But there certainly has been studies on changing calving season, and it can be done. And there are some advantages for doing it, but with the drought situation, I'm not sure that's the best route to go initially. I think there's some other decisions that we can make prior to that.
Okay, and then we have, is there an increase in disease due to drought? If so, what types of diseases?
So that's a great one. I don't know if I have a great answer for that. There has been some markers of maybe increased instances to treat, but I haven't seen anything disease specific.
I mean, it's going to be what's around that typical geographical area or what
Right.
we're going through type.
Right. Yeah, because I know, like, for instance, we had an issue. I mean, it wasn't drought related, well, kind of drought related, but we had like an issue with some coccidia and salmonella last year, and it was just because we had a warm spell, and that was the way everything dried out basically in our calving lot. But anyway, yeah, it just kind of varies, but I haven't seen anything, as I said, disease specific.
Okay, and so back just a look back on the 600 pounds, was that per week, per month, per season?
Oh, so that's basically for like carrying capacities. If you're thinking about AUMs for whatever that grazing duration was. And so the way that they, sorry, I'm trying to remember back to it. So I think the way that it was like a 60-day grazing allotment or something like that. But
okay, so
yeah, as I said, I'll share that publication in the chat.
Okay, and then probably the last, and then we probably have to start introducing our next speaker. What should producers prioritize when forced to make culling decisions because of drought?
Ooh, honestly, I would probably prioritize get rid of your thin cows. That's probably the biggest one, and get rid of the old cows. And so just based off those two are going to be kind of the biggest, they won't hurt you too bad later on down the road. I'll say it that way.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that. And you'll be staying on here. And so if there are other questions at the end,